All right, so 1, 2, 3. All right, so we're going to do 4.3 now. Let me go to the board here and get rid. All right, so sorry, really storming outside. Hope you can hear it because it's kind of nifty. All right, go to share my screen and let's go to, oh, here it is. So this is going to be a pretty interesting discussion today, right? So if I told you two propositions, all Tom Cruise's movies are hits, and Tom Cruise was just in Top Gun this summer, so I feel like while this might be an older edition using a proposition for a previous audience, we do have Tom Cruise again. So, and he's like 60 years old. And anyway, and then we also have all unicorns are one-horned animals. So if we have all unicorns are one-horned animals and all Tom Cruise movies are hits, maybe what is going on with the subject term in these universal propositions? Because when we use all Tom Cruise's movies are hits, and then we use the subject term unicorns, it seems like we're implying something about the existence of both Tom Cruise movies and unicorns. And it seems to be the case that unicorns is maybe problematic, right? So do you take a stand with the nouns that you use inside propositions? Because if we're talking honestly, because the subject term is distributed and we're making a claim about all X, whether X is unicorns or Tom Cruise's movies, it does seem to be the case that we're talking universally about unicorns or Tom Cruise movies. So that seems a little odd because on the one hand, if I were to say to you all unicorns are quadrupeds or all unicorns are one-horned animals, those two propositions about unicorns, right, seems, if we're implying the notion of existence of the subject term, how can the term be distributed and if we're implying the existence of what is distributed? So the first proposition implies that Tom Cruise has indeed made movies. In other words, this statement has existential import. It implies that one or more things denoted by the subject term actually exist, right? On the other hand, no such implication is made by the statement of unicorns. The statement might be said to be true because unicorns by definition have a single horn, but the statement does not imply that unicorns actually exist. So what's going on here? So the question arises in terms of our interpretation about what the subject term is doing inside universal propositions. And so the problem of existential import is a problem about how to conceptualize the role that universal propositions play. And this includes both the A propositions and the E propositions. Now, for purposes of ease, I think it's easier to use the A proposition like the book is using, right? So there's two standpoints on whether or not statements should have, if existential import should be a consideration in how we might interpret A and E propositions in categorical logic. So let's go over the Aristotelian standpoint. So the Aristotelian standpoint takes a stand and says that statements should be judged by existential import. And the word existential import just basically means that the statement is referencing real stuff in the world such that we can see if it's true or false, right? So if I said to you, all pheasants are birds, right? That implies the existence of pheasants, and that pheasants fit inside the predicate term bird. If I said to you, no pine trees are maples, that implies the existence of pine trees. And then if we reversed it and we said no maples or pine trees, that would also imply the existence of maples. So now Seder, right? Let me actually bring up, because I think it's important to kind of have a picture. So satyrs are right? Satyrs are these like horned goat people, right? And that's a good example. So that's a satyr, right? And they're like horned people. They've got the legs of a goat, right? And they have horns here. And then if you say, for instance, all satyrs are vile creatures, for Aristotle, that actually doesn't imply the existence of satyrs, right? Because they're not real. So existential import counts. And the logician has to sort of take a stand on Aristotle. So the third statement has no existential import because satyrs do not exist. On the other hand, according to the theory developed by the 19th century logician George Boole, no universal propositions have existential import to begin with. Now, you don't really need to know anything about George Boole. The only thing that I want you to know is the Boolean standpoint interpretation does have a bearing on how we construct the modern square of opposition. And we're not gonna use the traditional square of opposition in terms of looking at the various relationships between the different propositions. So, ooh, that was a big one. So all trucks are vehicles. That doesn't imply the existence of trucks. No roses or daisies. Nothing is implied about roses. And then all werewolves are monsters. That does not imply the existence of werewolves. Right? I'm sorry, I hit that. So basically, in a nutshell, the Aristotelian, so this is a pretty good what I want you to sort of take away from this, right? So the Aristotelian, the Aristotelian standpoint differs from the Boolean standpoint only with regard to universal propositions. The two standpoints are identical with regard to I and O propositions. Both Aristotelian and Boolean standpoints recognize that particular propositions make positive assertions about existence. For example, from both standpoints, the statement "some cats are animals" asserts that at least one cat exists that's an animal. Also, from both standpoints, "some fish are not mammals" asserts that at least one fish exists that's not a mammal. Thus, from both standpoints, the word "some" implies existence. And then here's the second one. Let's go here, right? Adopting either the Aristotelian or Boolean standpoint amounts to accepting a set of ground rules for interpreting the meaning of universal propositions. Either standpoint can be adopted for any categorical proposition or any argument composed of categorical propositions. Taking the Aristotelian standpoint amounts to recognizing that universal statements about existing things convey evidence about existence. So the role of universal proposition is to make claims of evidence that support the existence of what they're referencing. Conversely, for a statement to convey such evidence, the Aristotelian standpoint must be taken and the subject of the statement must denote actually existing things, because that's an Aristotelian concern. Taking the Boolean standpoint, on the other hand, amounts to ignoring any evidence about the existence that universal statements might convey, right? Because the Boolean standpoint is close to existence, it's simpler than the Aristotelian standpoint, which recognizes existential implications. For this reason, we will redirect our attention to arguments considered from the Boolean standpoint and later in 4.5 from the Aristotelian standpoint. So the rest of the chapter is basically Boolean. And in order to understand why that emphasis, we needed to sort of go over that. But now let's take a look. We're not going to do the problems in this homework and at the end of this chapter on Venn diagrams, but I sort of want you to sort of see, because Venn diagrams are a really wonderful way to sort of visually convey, again, what these things are actually doing, right? And it's kind of interesting. So when we say all dogs are mammals, what we are saying is no members of dogs are ever outside the category mammals. And when we say no reptiles are mammals, we're saying no members of reptiles are ever inside the category mammals. If we say some cats are animals, right, we're saying at least one cat exists that is an animal, even if there are many. And then if we say some Ford cars are not hot rods, then we're saying there's at least one S that is not a hot rod. And so my Ford Fiesta probably counts, right? So now we can actually take a look at these things visually, right? So before we actually do that, let's take a look at like what each of these things are. So inside each of these circles, right, denotes. So the purple, if you're not colorblind or have no visual impairment, right? This purple area of 1, which inside the circle will also include aspects of 2, but inside this big circle is Americans, right? Imagine every member of this class is an American. And then here's this other circle right here, right? And 2 and 3, right? So the green and the blue, but have farmers. Now, in between with number 2 is both Americans and farmers. So American farmers fill the space of number 2. So conceptually, there's some overlap there, right? And we draw these circles to encompass all the members of the class of objects that would be of the subject or predicate term, right? So if I said to you, all Americans are farmers, right? That's technically false because you and I are probably not farmers. But, right? We would understand this to sort of convey information that pertains to the objects inside these visual circles. Now, the number 4 is outside both. So anything that is both a non-American and a non-farmer. So this marker is neither a farmer nor an American, right? So a marker is number 4. This paper towel that I used to wipe the board with, that is technically number 4. So anything that's non-American and non-farmers is technically outside the scope of what's contained inside the categories or the class of objects that would fill those categories, right? So this is also like, this is visual representation. You also get to see a little bit about like how we're organizing or conceptualizing spatially what we're actually doing in categorical logic, right? So now, if we were to do Venn diagrams, we could convey information, right? Now there's 2 kinds of marks that are used. You could shade an area and place an X in an area. Shading an area means that the shaded area is empty and doesn't pertain to what we're talking about. So if we say all dogs are mammals, the S that is not inside P is not being used, so I shade it according to the Boolean standpoint, right? And then I would have this left unmarked. Or if I said to you, no reptiles are mammals, this is a little bit easier to grasp. Let me go back over here, right? So remember, I might have said this already, but I don't know if I visually drew it. But if we have reptiles in this circle right here, and then we have mammals, they don't ever touch because there's never a reptile that's mammal, right? So there's never going to be anything in the overlap. So notice inside the book, what we do is we take and then we shade that middle area to indicate this, that they're not touching. And so we, in the Boolean standpoint interpretation of Venn diagrams, we shade the unused area, so to speak, right? So, and now in a universal proposition, if I were just in a universal proposition, all dogs are mammals, right? This would just be dogs that's never part of mammals. So we shade that area to indicate this is where, you know, especially this is conceptually, but we leave the area on the area being used empty, so to speak, right? And the unused area that, and it's a little bit more intuitive for the E propositions, no SRP, than it is for the universals. Okay. So let me go back. Now, with some SRP, this is really easy, right? So some cats are animals, right? We just indicate an X, that there is at least one S that is also part of P, right? So it's in between. And then if we say some S are not P, right, we put an X in the area. Like, so if we said some Ford cars are not hot rods. A handful, but not all of a particular class, but a handful of Ford cars will be over here outside of hot rod, right? And among them will be my Ford Fiesta, so to speak. So that kind of builds up what we're doing. I'm going to make 2 videos for 4.3 because I feel like this is a lot of information to kind of be thrown your way. But what we're going to do in this section of the chapter 4.3, that will concern, so I'm sorry, let me go over here. That'll concern the immediate inferences at the very end. But in order, anyway, there's a lot of reasons why all of these things sort of run together, and you sort of need to explain aspects of all the different things. Like you can kind of see the difference between the Aristotelian and the Boolean, even though we're just using the Boolean and we're ignoring 4.5 for the purposes of the course, right? It's still important to know the difference between, like, there is a little bit of conceptualization about how these propositions are behaving and should existential import be a consideration. So this is going to be 4.3 part 1, and then I'm going to come in with 4.3 part 2 with the homework practice in that video as well. Just I think it conceptually makes more sense to sort of organize it that way. And this is just a lecture to get to that other part, because these things sort of they sort of nest together in a latticework of concepts that you need to explain in order to sort of understand these things. Okay, so I'm going to end this lecture, and then we're going to start 4.3 with the immediate inferences, and that's going to bring together a large portion of things in the course. We're going to get back the concept of validity. We're going to get back the concept of, immediate inferences are kind of arguments that show how we will test for validity in syllogisms, right? So it's kind of like a proto test for validity of the type of things that we do in logic. And so it's a really good exercise to sort of bring together some formal concepts that we thought we might have lost, right? But, validity was with us in chapter 1. We saw it with formal fallacies in section 3.1, and now we're seeing the concept of validity all over again, and it's a foundational concept in both categorical and sentential logic, right? So no matter where you go in logic, the concept of validity will always be there. Now remember, the concept of validity is a property of deductive arguments with a certain form, such that if I have true premises with that form, my conclusion cannot be false. Right? So if you get true and false in a test for validity, like if you get premises true and then the conclusion false in any way, then you know you have an invalid argument. And that's something you need to remember going into the next section. Don't worry, I'm going to say that again, but I'm just saying it at the very end of this lecture to build momentum for 4.3 coming up. Okay? All right. Take care. And remember, keep thinking logically.